This is a lecture on Hegel, Marx, and dialectics. It builds upon what was discussed in the previous lecture on Rousseau, Kant, and the project of eternal peace, in which we also looked at this question of how progress is something that happens in Kantian thought through conflict. And this idea of conflict as being the motor of history is something that's going to enter into the thought of both Hegel and Marx, but they're going to have very different, views about what actually is the reason for the conflict that is the motor of history. So we're going to look at their different views, and now they're the epistemologies that are developed by Hegel and Marx out of the thought of Kant are what's called dialectical, and Marx is, as we're going to see, very much indebted to the thought of Hegel insofar as he adopts this dialectical epistemology developed by Hegel. But later thinkers in the Marxian tradition, like Althusser, are going to try to rid Marxism of its Hegelian component. There's a lot of debate about this. We're not going to. There are a lot. In fact, there are a lot of debates about Hegel and Marx that are quite, complex. And there's a vast literature out there on both Hegel and Marx, and you can very quickly start to drown in it if you start looking into it more deeply. And so I want to observe here at the beginning that this is a lecture intended for people who are new to the thought of Hegel and Marx, and people who are coming to these questions for the first time. That is, it's funny. Noam Chomsky once said that he hasn't the foggiest idea what this multi-syllable word dialectics means. It's kind of a strange thing to say from someone who has also lectured often on the topic of Marxism. I want to suggest to you that there's really nothing controversial about this term, and it's not that difficult to understand. But I'm going to try to present the material here today in a way that someone even as thick-witted as Chomsky can be on occasion, so that even Mr. Chomsky can understand these basic concepts that we're going to review today. Again, I've entitled the lecture Hegel, Marx, and Dialectics. There you can see Hegel to the left and Marx to the right. We said previously in the previous lecture that generationally speaking, that Hegel is about at the same distance from Marx as he is from Kant. He's positioned, in between the two. So we do have a sense in which this thinking of history and progress, which we have already discussed in Kant, is rethought by the subsequent generations, and is enormously influential. Now there are, let me say, there are plenty of other thinkers in the German idealist tradition who we're not going to have a whole lot of time to address, like Fichte, for instance. But when we get to Derrida's Specters of Marx towards the end of this series of lectures that I'm giving, we'll return to some of these debates and look at them in a more complex way than we're presenting here today. So just to review, we said that in Kant's Towards Eternal Peace, published in 1795, that he shows how, in his view anyway, historical progress comes through war and conflict, but these terrible wars that we endure are not without reason. We said that his idea of progress, just to review, was a conceptual retooling of the Leibnizian view about providence, and one of the things that we identified in Kant's essay was this idea of a more propria or avant-garde is another way of talking about this, or what we talked about earlier in our discussion of Plato with the thymotic part of the soul, a thymotic desire, which he said is a kind of a desire for a desire to be recognized, to have one's worth recognized. As we're going to see for Hegel, this is going to be the motor of history, in effect, or what propels the historical conflicts that we find ourselves in. Again, you see there on the right an image from Homer's Iliad, and this is again the scene of Achilles killing Hector. Again, really important text, founding text, the Iliad. So what's interesting about this conflict, of course, is that Achilles is fighting merely for the recognition of his name, for his which he hopes to live long after him. He wants to be known as a man who is brave, who shows bravery in the face of his impending death, who has great courage, and in fact, in a Hegelian sense, we could say he even shows contempt for his own life, because there's something more important for him than mere survival. Hector, by contrast, whom Achilles slays, is defending his home. He's merely trying to make sure that his family and his home are safe from these invading Greeks. So the story of the Iliad has a lot to teach us about what we're going to be discussing today in terms of Hegelian spiritedness or recognition. It's again a text I do recommend that you familiarize yourself with. Now, Hegel lived from 1770 to 1831. He wrote many works, but some of his best known works, his most important works, are Phenomenology of Mind and Phenomenology of Spirit, both published in 1807. And then The Science of Logic, or sometimes just called Hegel's Logic, 1812 through 1816. I believe he did a revision of that as well, I think in 1830, 31, a number of years later. So Hegel remains a philosopher of enormous significance. And I recall back in the early 90s when Frederick Jameson published a book, very interesting book called Late Marxism, about Theodor Adorno in the Frankfurt School. He wrote of Hegel, he predicted, he said that there would be an impending Hegelian revival in the winds. I thought this was a false prophecy back in the early 90s. I'm not so sure today it's proven to be false, because there does seem to be a resurgence of interest in Hegel. My own interest in Hegel came out of my reading in the Frankfurt School of critical theorists, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, a number of these prominent, figures who are associated with the Frankfurt School, and were influenced by Sergei Lukács, a Hungarian Hegelian Marxist as well. These are all really important contemporary thinkers who are, one could say, neo-Hegelian. They have no interest whatsoever in voiding the Marxian dialectics or Marxism of its Hegelian component, unlike Althusser in France and those associated with this, what comes to be known sort of a structuralist Marxism. At that time, as Jameson observes, Hegel became a kind of a code word for Stalin because of his concept of totality came to be associated with a kind of a totalitarianism that many intellectuals in France, particularly those on the left, like Althusser, were very uncomfortable with. Because this was the problem, of course, in Europe for the Frankfurt School theorists as well as for Adorno, and that is that these were non-aligned Marxisms. In other words, they promoted Marxisms that didn't want to be associated with the Soviet Union. And so while not directly criticizing Soviet Marxism, Althusser sort of quietly went about critiquing the idea of Hegelian totality, tried to rethink Marxism in non-Hegelian terms. The question remains for people who are interested in Marxian theory: is it really possible to articulate a Marxism that has no Hegelian component, or is Marxian thought so deeply intertwined with Hegelian thought that you really can't take out the Hegelian element? Well, that's a debate that you can look further into. I just wanted to bring it to your attention. Okay, so we're going to also be talking about briefly about Alexander Kojève. We're not reading his very important work called The Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, published in 1947. You can see he lived between 1902 and 1968. One of the most important things about him, however, was not so much his corpus of published writings, but the influence he had as a lecturer in Paris upon many French intellectuals. And you can see they're associated with continental philosophy and structuralism, post-structuralism. You can see, for instance, Bataille, André Breton is the father of surrealism, Michel Leiris, who became an anthropologist, traveled with not Jean Rouch, but Marcel Griol to West Africa, and Lacan, of course, a psychoanalyst, a neo-Freudian thinker, and who also tries to bring structuralism into Freudian psychoanalysis: Merleau-Ponty, Foucault, Derrida, Fukuyama. These are just some of the people that Kojève influenced. We're not going to be talking as much about him, but we are going to be talking about him to the extent that it's relevant to an understanding of Fukuyama and Specters of Marx, because this figure is going to prove prominent in the thinking of Fukuyama. So when we look at Hegel today, and let me go to the next slide here. This is a picture of Francis Fukuyama. He almost came to Western Washington University a number of years ago. I think he had got ill, or had maybe it was a motorcycle accident or something that prevented him from coming. So he canceled his lecture. But in any case, he rose to prominence in the United States and elsewhere in 1992 with the publication of this book, The End of History and the Last Man, that we're also going to be studying. And he also is associated with the neocons in American politics, conservative theorists on the right, who all, as did Fukuyama, supported George W. Bush in his desire to invade Iraq, as did also Joe Biden. And Hillary Clinton, we mustn't forget. He's going to speak of this kind. He kind of conflates Hegel and Kojève together. He mixes this syncretic invention that he calls Hegel, Kojève, and so Kojève. So his Hegel is one that's refracted through the lens of Kojève, who had a kind of an idiosyncratic articulation of Hegel, but nonetheless very interesting, very provocative. And then later we're going to see in Specters of Marx that Derrida is going to criticize Fukuyama for being a kind of a latecomer to the influence of Kojève, since many of the people that Derrida was associated with and who were of his generation had kind of gone through their Kojèvian period many years prior to the publication of The End of History and Last Man. And so he's going to be kind of puzzling over how and why this text by Fukuyama, which brings Kojève back to the forefront, why was it so late in assuming this kind of international prominence? And indeed, whether you love Fukuyama's work or don't love it, it was a very influential text at the time that it appeared, and it was widely debated. It's not only a matter of Derrida responding to it. One of the reasons why Derrida is responding to it is precisely because it had such wide currency at the time. We'll return to this later, but I wanted to bring to your attention both of these thinkers as well, because as we quickly review the basic ideas of Hegel. I'm going to be drawing from Fukuyama, who does, I think there are problems with his reading of Hegel, which Derrida is going to discuss as well. But nonetheless, he does a really nice job. He's a very gifted writer. He does a very nice job of concisely articulating the main ideas in the Hegelian notion of spiritedness. Okay, so questions to consider that we're going to ask ourselves. What are dialectics? What is dialectical materialism? So hopefully by the end of this lecture, these things will become clearer to you. And again, I'm not assuming any prior knowledge for my students at Western Washington University. Most of you have had English 313, but that doesn't mean that which is the introduction to critical theory. Unfortunately, it's not. The course is not taught in an even way, so you may have never heard these terms before. I can't, in any case, assume that you have, which is why I have to go over these basic concepts so that we can then understand what is to follow when we look at Fukuyama's text and the Specters of Marx by Derrida. So here's this quote from Chomsky. It comes from Understanding Power. Whenever words like dialectics come along, or hermeneutics, I reach for my revolver. He's quoting Goering, a Nazi, sort of a really stupid thing to say. I mean, I don't know if he's trying to be funny here or what his point is. It may be that it's not stupidity. It may be that it's just more demagoguery. It's a way of trying to instill fear in his audience rather than, again, appeal to reason. That is the quintessential definition of what it means to be a demagogue. He's going to also say, again, I haven't the foggiest idea what dialectics means. And you don't know if maybe he's serious, maybe he doesn't understand it. It's hard to say. His thinking often is quite rigid. Okay, Hegelian dialectics. All right, so this is, again, basic review. These are some terms you need to know: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay, so we're going to just quickly review them. What we call a thesis. We've already encountered this concept in our discussion of Descartes. This is an intuitive interior assertion, like when Kant asserts his cogito, which is a metaphysical claim. And so one of the reasons why, for instance, as we're going to later see, why Heidegger will view, and Derrida as well, are going to view Hegel as in their interpretation, Hegel does not escape metaphysics by any means, although he claims to be doing something very different than Kant with respect to metaphysics. Nonetheless, the Heideggerian, Derridian reading of Hegel is that he's going to remain ensconced in metaphysics, or another way to say this is that he's effectively remains Cartesian in his orientation, despite his claim to have sublated metaphysics. Well, thesis, and part of the reason for this is that thetic propositions are always predicated on metaphysical grounds. And so does he escape metaphysics? Does he not escape metaphysics? I mean, you can be the judge of this. But I do want to draw your attention to the deconstructive reading of Hegel, which is that he does not escape metaphysics. And I also want to note that with what we're going to call the subject-object dialectic, that this is something that deconstructive thinkers like Heidegger and Derrida are going to claim to have broken from the dialectics, that they're not doing dialectics. Similarly, they're going to reject the Hegelian concept of subject, which they're going to see as delimiting the human entity that we are, what Heidegger is going to call the Dasein, to a merely rational subject constructed purely through reason, and one that is oblivious to other factors that are determinant of our Dasein, to put it in Heideggerian terms. Well, we'll come back to that. But in any case, the subject in the Hegelian in dialectics asserts a thesis, which we said is an intuitive interior assertion it is, as we're going to see, a matter of spirit, because the thesis is literally sort of spit out of the mouth. It's a matter of aspirated breath or wind. And the antithesis then would be the negation of that thesis, so that the Hegelian man who seeks to spiritualize the world inevitably finds himself confronted with a negative force that will seek to arrest what he's doing. And so this is partly becomes at the basis of this conflict that is for Hegel the motor of history. Okay, now the synthesis, the German is Aufhebung. It means, it's a word that is often kept in the original German because, although it's translated sometimes as sublate, but it's kept in the original German because there's not really an English word that conveys everything that this word conveys, because what it effectively means, the word synthesis, is to preserve, which in other words, preserve something of the thesis that is asserted, to cancel, and the antithesis is the negation of the thesis or the cancellation of the thesis, but it also means to elevate or to raise up, but it means all three at the same time. Okay, so Hegelian thinking is interested in totalities and the concept of totality. Major Hegelian concept. I think it was Martin Jay wrote a very interesting book called Totality, the History of a Concept. It might be one that you might be interested in having a look at if you're interested in Hegel. But the total is linked to this idea of the synthesis or the whole. Okay, so if you look at the image on the right, you see a circle there with the line drawn through it. You can think of the thesis. If you look on the left side, we could think of the thesis as emanating from that half of the circle. The antithesis from the other side, the right side of the circle, and the synthesis would not be a new thesis as much as it would be the total or the whole, the sublation of both. Okay, so all right, subject-object dialectical epistemology. Well, let's think about this terms in what's called in terms of what is called the subject-object dialectic. Okay, or knowing the world, epistemologies, ways of knowing the world according to the subject-object dialectical model that is in Hegelian and Marxian thought. Okay, so if we look at our image of the circle, we think on the right, we can imagine, I could inscribe there subject or ego, which is just the Latin word for I. And on the left side, on the other side of the circle, we could write the word object, or id, which is the Latin word for it. And the transcendental subject or the transcendental ego of Hegel would not be one side or other of the circle, but it would be both altogether. All right, so it would be a matter of the whole. But transcendental in this sense is not meant to be in the way that we've used it before as beyond the five senses. It's rather a matter of a whole sublation or a synthesis of the ego and the id into a new formulation. So another way to say this is that my I or my ego, I only get an I or an ego insofar as I interact dialectically with the world of material objects. Okay, so if we think of the name, if we were to inscribe the name on the objective side of this circle, the name would be an image or objective representation of myself, but I would have to embrace that representation of myself and bring it back into my subjective consciousness before I could have a consciousness at all. And the same would be true, say, like if I look at an image of myself in the mirror or a photograph of myself, the ego would be a matter of the perceiving subject looking out at the objective world. The image of myself, let's see, the photograph that I might see of myself, or the image that I see on a computer screen, would be something that I would have to embrace and bring it into my consciousness, effectively spiritualizing it, to put it in Hegelian terms. And spirit in this sense would be what projects the I towards the it, or what projects the subject or the ego towards the object or the id. And this is also why, for instance, Hegelian thought is sometimes is a kind of, it's linked to Christian theology as well. We could think of what we've already talked about in terms of, let's say, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We think of the doctrine of the Trinity. It's very similar to what Hegel is articulating here, although Hegel is claiming that there's no metaphysical ground to what he's asserting. But we could think of if we were to inscribe Father on the side of where we said that we would inscribe the word ego, that if you think of the Father in heaven, the Son would be the objective representation of the Father in the realm of becoming, to put it in Platonic terms. In the Christian Trinity, the idea of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they would say, well, the Spirit is the love of the Father for the Son. All right, so similarly, we can think of the subject, that its projection outside of itself is a matter of spirit, much like it is in the doctrine of the Christian Trinity. All right, well, we'll work more on this question of spirit, but one question that I'm going to ask here. I don't want to, I have my own views about this, but I'm not interested in converting anybody to my own views as much as making sure that we understand what these concepts are. And so the question I want to pose for you here to think about is as we go through and go deeper into this question of what is spirit in Hegel, is spirit in Hegel a metaphysical concept? Or does Hegel succeed in evading metaphysics, for instance, in the way that someone like Frederick Jameson will assert? Is Hegel a neo-Cartesian thinker? Is this a fair criticism of Hegel? And I pose that because also, there is, it's often, I'll just say, let me put it this way. And one of the common things that I see happen all the time in critical theory and debates that occur in critical theory is, one of the sort of the classic moves that you can always make to defeat your opponent in critical theory, if you find yourself in some sort of Hegelian conflict with someone, is to accuse them of being neo-Cartesian, because it's very difficult to escape this neo-Cartesian epistemology. It's very difficult to get out of metaphysics. And so, and deconstruction as a thought system, has for its aim to get out of this sort of metaphysical conundrum, but that doesn't mean that one always is successful in that endeavor. And so we're going to see that, for instance, when Derrida critiques Marx, one of the things he's going to say is that Marx, sometimes does make good on his claim to having escaped metaphysics, and other times he doesn't make very good on that claim. But that's true. One could say the same of Derrida. One could say the same of Heidegger. For all of us. So it's it's a lot harder to get out of metaphysics than one might imagine. So this is also why I'm saying here, is it really fair to call him a neo-Cartesian? Or, maybe on the other hand, maybe it really is fair. Maybe there is a metaphysical ground in Hegel's thought that he is, simply oblivious to, and that we can clearly identify. Okay, so what propels the Hegelian dialectic, which you said leads to this kind of utopian teleology? What does Hegel mean by spirit? Okay, so let's quote. Now, this quote here is from Hegel himself. He says, it is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. Only thus is it tried and proven that the essential nature of self-consciousness is not bare existence, is not the merely immediate form in which it at first makes its appearance. The individual who has not staked his life may no doubt be recognized as a person, but he has not attained the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. Okay, but what does that mean? All right, we're gonna try to unpack that, but let's underscore here this question of this first part of the sentence. It is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. Okay, well, that's something to kind of think about. He's going to say the individual who has not staked his life may no doubt be recognized as a person, but he has not attained the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. Okay, so we want to note here then, this is a key aspect of Hegelian thought, is that the is a matter of sort of spirit, is a matter of showing contempt for one's own life, for one's own very existence, because there's something more important than mere survival, and that is is this desire to be recognized, or to have one's worth in a thematic sense recognized by the other. And so the person who attains freedom is the one who is who is not afraid to die, who has confronted death, and who is willing to confront it again. And this is again why Achilles is such a prominent figure. The figure in war who knows that there's the warrior who knows that there's a very good chance, maybe even probability, maybe it's even a certainty that he or she will die, and yet doesn't back down from the challenge, because there's something really more important than merely living. And this later is going to become a part of what is develops into what is known as the master-slave dialectic, because for Hegel, the slave is precisely the person who is not willing to engage in this combat for recognition, for whom who is willing to submit to the master rather than face the risk of possible death. So the master is that person who does have the capacity or shows the willingness to risk everything for something more important than mere survival. Okay, here's Kojève saying something very similar in his introduction to reading Hegel. Both of these quotes you'll find also in Fukuyama, whom I'm going to be reading from in just a minute. Kojève says, all human anthropogenetic desire, the desire that generates self-consciousness, the human reality, is finally a function of the desire for recognition. To speak of the origin of self-consciousness is necessarily to speak of a fight to the death for recognition. Okay, let me underscore that last phrase again, a fight to the death for recognition. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're moving closer to an understanding of what spirit is, or spiritedness is, willing to fight to the death, to die for recognition. Okay, now Hegel will speak of this kind of first man, and let me just say quickly here, the idea of the first man you'll find in the thinking of Hegel, but Fukuyama is going to really develop it at a lot more length. And so the first man is the first man who has achieved recognition as a man, and is in that way is different from the animals. So we do find it again. This is a theme that we'll be following through. We read also Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, for those of you who are reading it, that we've already discussed when we were talking about Descartes. Is the question of human animal differences, and this is a theme that follows all throughout Western philosophy. We called Aristotle, who said, calls man the rational animal. Hegel is saying something very similar, but Hegel like he's saying something similar insofar as the thesis is underwritten by a ground, which is the ground of reason. But so in that sense, in a metaphysical sense, we could say this is particularly going to be the Heideggerian view that Hegel does not escape, metaphysics. But we also find, and I wanted to draw attention to here, is the idea that man and animal are different. And Hegel, as much as Descartes, is going to want to draw distinctions between human beings and animals, and what it means in order to articulate what it means to be a man, as opposed to, say, a mere animal. Okay, All right, and this also makes the animal akin, and let's say in Platonic terms of what we call the logic of the dangerous supplement. This makes the animal a kind of a supplement to man, much like the slave is a supplement to the master in this dialectical discourse. Okay, Hegel denied that he had a state of nature doctrine, and in fact would have rejected the concept of a human nature permanent and unchanging. Man for him was free and undetermined, and therefore capable of creating his own nature in the course of historical time. Hegel's first man shares with the animals certain basic natural desires, such as the desire for food, for sleep, for shelter, and above all, his own life. He's concerned with his own self-preservation. But Hegel's first man is radically different from the animals in that he desires not only real positive objects, for instance, food and shelter, but also objects that are totally non-material. Okay, and we're back to this question of spirit. Above all, he desires the desire of other men. Okay, this is a desire for a desire. Okay, or was it as the Cheap Trick song goes, I want you to want me. And if you don't want me, it makes me angry. I desire to be desired. That is, to be wanted by others or to be recognized. Indeed, for Hegel, an individual could not become self-conscious, that is, become aware of himself as a separate being without being recognized by other human beings. Hegel's man wants not only to be recognized by other men, but to be recognized as a man. And what constitutes man's identity as man, the most fundamental and uniquely human characteristic, is man's ability to risk his own life. Thus, the first man's encounter with the other leads to a violent struggle in which each contestant seeks to make the other recognize him by risking his own life. Okay, so think of again that image that we saw of Achilles locked into combat. And so, and Sartre, for instance, in a wonderful metaphor, is going to, when he speaks about capitalism and how the capitalist mode of production is the battle of all against all. He's going to use this image of a boxing match at being in Vegas, Las Vegas, of being constitutive of history. So imagine two men in a ring just pounding each other to death, beating each other to death. And the question is what are they fighting over? What is the fight about? And we're going to see that one of the main differences is between Hegel and Marx is that in the Hegelian view of the dialectic of how history progresses through conflict is they're fighting for the desire to they're fighting to be recognized. They want to each have their worth recognized by the other. Now Fukuyama will also speak of what he calls megalothymia, which is the desire to be. It's a term that he himself coins. You won't find it in Hegel, but it's the desire to have one's superiority recognized. And you can think of, for instance, Achilles would be driven by this kind of megalothymia. He doesn't want just to be recognized. Achilles, it seems at times anyway, he wants to be known as the best, as superior to everyone. Well, that would be megalothymia, at least in the way that Fukuyama is articulating it. But I think one of the interesting points Fukuyama makes, and note this was a text that appeared before 9/11, is people will go to war because they feel humiliated, and if we think of those people on those planes that bombed those World Trade Centers, the depth of humiliation that must have driven them to do something as monstrous as what they did and burn themselves up as well as everybody else is it's really hard. It's mind-boggling. Who knows why there are complex reasons, obviously, why they did that. They did what they did, but I think that the question that Fukuyama is raising is quite legitimate, because sometimes struggles are not about just goods. Sometimes people do fight because they do feel themselves to be humiliated. I think there's a lot of truth in that. But this debate, that Fukuyama characterizes between the Hegelians and the Marxians about what is the motor of history. It's an interesting debate. I don't want to suggest what the right answer is, but I do want you to understand what the issues are in this debate. Okay. All right. By risking his life, man proves that he can act contrary to his most powerful and basic instinct, the instinct for self-preservation. The reason that I fight is to get another human being to recognize the fact that I am willing to risk my life, and that I am therefore free and authentically human. Now, animals do fight for survival, and this is something that Fukuyama notes as well. It's Hegel, but only man is capable, in this view, of engaging in a bloody battle for the sole purpose of demonstrating that he has contempt for his own life. Let's continue with Fukuyama. Hegel's emphasis on the importance of the risk of death points to something very real and important. Whether or not true free will exists, virtually all humans act as if it does. Okay, as if is placed there in italics. We'll come back to this. And evaluate each other on the basis of their ability to make what they believe to be genuinely moral choices, or genuine moral choices. Human freedom emerges only when man is able to transcend his natural animal existence and to create a new self for himself. Okay, so now I think we're getting a clearer sense of what freedom means in Hegel. It's different than what we talked about with regard to liberty in our previous reading of Rousseau. Freedom comes on the other side of your overcoming your fear of death and your willingness to fight for something more than mere survival. That is what is truly spirited. Okay, that is what it means to be a spirited person. But I want to note here that this question of that, and I think this is one of the problems in Fukuyama's reading, is he doesn't sufficiently problematize some of his claims. And here, when he says again, whether or not true free will exists, virtually all humans act as if it does, and evaluate each other on the basis of their ability to make what they believe to be genuinely moral choices. Well, this begs the question of metaphysics, and so one doesn't solve the problem of metaphysics just by saying we're going to proceed as if there's a metaphysical ground. Now, this as if that we find dropped into this text has a history. This is one of the key phrases that you find in the writings of Kant, and Kant is essentially going to say this about metaphysics, is or for instance, when he speaks of the apprehension or the perception of the beautiful object that one beholds, he's going to say, well, we don't know we can't say, unless we're going to be dogmatic about it in a religious sense, we can't say if there is a truly abiding, truly intangible existing essence within the beloved that we behold. But we can say that the beautiful form, that the form that is beautiful because it is as if it has an essence embedded within it. So Kantian, this is a quintessentially Kantian gesture to bracket off metaphysics by claiming, or by asserting that it's as if there is a transcendental ground, but to go further than that would be to enter into a kind of a dogmatic sphere that say that Kantians and those influenced by him they're not willing to go there, and this is also the case for Hegel. Okay, Karl Marx. Again, we're going quickly here. for time's sake, and because we've got a lot to cover. So we're going to review some key thoughts here. Now, we're not going to get into the complexities of Marxian theory. You could spend your lifetime doing that. We're not going to do that today for sure. I just want to clarify two things here as we're going through Marx. One, what his critique of Hegel is, how he both builds from Hegel or draws upon Hegel, but also criticizes Hegel. And then secondly, to try to get a sense of what what he means by dialectics and what propels the dialectical, his historical materialist dialectics in his thought. Okay, and we won't review again thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We've already seen in Hegel, because that same kind of epistemological model is operative in Marx. The difference is, or their disagreement comes not on that, but on how they conceptualize what the reason is for the cause of this historical conflict, or what propels the dialectic in history. Okay, now there's a number, I just quote here, that Marx wrote a lot. These are just some of the key texts. The German Ideology in 1845. This is what we'll be quoting from today, because this is where Marx has his critique of Hegel and the post-Hegelian thinkers. The Communist Manifesto, also co-written with Engels. This is a wonderful text to study, to get an encapsulation of some of the key ideas in Marxism. But you can't imagine that you've exhausted your understanding of Marxism merely by reading this document, as I think when Jordan Peterson sort of disastrously prepared for his debate with Zizek merely by reading the Communist Manifesto. Well, it's a good starting place, and it does encapsulate many of the key ideas, but it's certainly not all there is to know about Marxism. Is not in this document, but I do recommend it. Capital, Volume 1 through 3. These are big fat books written from 1867, and then the last two were posthumously edited by Engels. Volume 1 is probably the most important. We're going to find Derrida doing a deconstructive reading of Volume 1 of Capital in Specters of Marx, when he's going to focus on this image of the dancing table in Capital, when Marx is trying to meditate on what he calls the mystery of the commodity form. Okay, so Marx's dialectical materialism, what does it involve? All right. Let's attend to the language of Marx. Again, I like to honor these writers, theorists, philosophers by actually reading their words, not just merely paraphrasing them. Here's Marx. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. Okay, now the question there that we're going to have to kind of think about, and that Derrida is going to think about when he does this deconstructive reading of Marx and Specters of Marx, is what do we mean by real? When we say they are real individuals, this is the $1 million question, because we're back to the question of the real. Okay, all right. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. The first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Okay, so let's pause for just a minute on the sentence, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Because what Marx is really talking about here is a very important key concept in Marxist thought, and that is the concept of the mode of production. And so you really need to know this if you want to understand what Marxism is, whether it's to criticize it or to celebrate it. You've got to be grounded in this idea of the mode of production. Okay, and so I'm defining it here as the way a society organizes itself to meet the problem of scarcity. Okay, so if you understand what's being said there, you're going to be a long ways on your way towards understanding what Marxism is all about. Okay, now, so another way to say this, and we'll think more about this question of scarcity, is scarcity is a matter of lack. It's a matter of something that isn't there. Okay, and so every society finds itself confronted with this problem. And this is also going to become to be known as sort of the base superstructure. What Marx is calling, the economic base, or the economic, is precisely this question or matter of scarcity, or this absence that's felt so acutely that it brings into being a particular form, a social form, to address this problem. Okay. And so what Marx is going to say is that, look, there's not an infinite number of ways that a society can organize itself to meet the problem of scarcity. And historically, we can identify really only about, 7 or 8 different ways, 7 or 8, depending on whether or not the socialist mode of production is distinct from the communist mode of production. There's debate among Marxian theorists about this. But let's just quickly identify what the basic modes of production are. There's the primitive tribal mode of production, the ancient polis mode of production. This would be like a slavery-based society, like, say, in ancient Athens. The gens or kinship mode of organization based in family hierarchies, kind of like the mafioso type structures. There's the Oriental Asiatic mode of production. This is one of Marx's more controversial concepts, but it's linked to this idea of how a society that organizes itself around the body of a despot, often imagined to be a divine entity. If you want to explore this further, you might have a look at Bertolucci's film, The Last Emperor, which is a really fascinating sort of case study. And Bertolucci himself is Marxist. And he was trying to, I think, if you were to put it in theoretical terms, what he was doing in that film was to show what happens when a society moves from this Oriental Asiatic mode of production very rapidly to a socialist mode of production, and the contrast between the two are quite jarring. It's an interesting film. All right, there's the feudal mode of production, which prevailed in Europe prior to capitalism. Lords, kings, knights, serfs, so on, who till the fields. And then there's the capitalist mode of production, which we currently find ourselves living within. And then the socialist communist mode of production, which he seeks to bring, into existence by imagining a mode of production that is organized by human beings, rather than believing, like, let's say, in the liberal view of Burke of the invisible hand, that God guides the marketplace. In this mode of production, it's human beings, not God, that guides the economy. Okay. All right. Base superstructure. All right. Again, key terms to know, just to understand. If you're trying to understand Marxian thought and dialectics, again, the base, as we said already, if a mode of production is a way a society organizes itself to meet the problem of scarcity, we could think of the base as that key problem that the mode of production seeks to address. Different ways of talking about the base, or you could sometimes refer to as the economic, scarcity, necessity. Ananke was a Greek goddess. Ananke, the goddess of necessity. This goddess one never gave gifts to, because Ananke always got what was coming to her, so you didn't need to make any sacrifices to Ananke. Now, in the political unconscious, Frederick Jameson is going to refer to the base as a kind of an absent cause, or what hurts, what refuses desire. All right, so the superstructure, by contrast, is religion, law, education, sports, poetry, and police force. Okay. Now let me say, before saying a couple of remarks about superstructure, I want to say, for instance, that the claim that Jameson is going to make, that Marxism is indeed a post-metaphysical, or not a metaphysical theory, or philosophy is because the base is something that isn't there. So it's not a matter of organizing a mode of production around, let's say, a real object that is there. Let's say like the Kantian Ding an sich, because the base is something that is not there. It's absent. It's absent, but again, it's an absence that's felt so acutely that it brings a mode of production into form. Okay. All right. Superstructure. So in this base superstructure model, everything in our society, whether it's religion, law, education, sports, poetry, police force, et cetera, seems to have, it has a relative autonomy. It seems to be independent from the base, but finally, it does bear some relationship to the base. This does lead some, like Deleuze, for instance, to criticize, Marxism as a kind of an economic determinism. And I would want to make a distinction here between, what's called sort of vulgar Marxism and the kind of Marxism that one finds in the writings of Jameson, because there are a lot of, vulgar Marxisms out there. And the vulgar Marxism would be a form of Marxism that rushes too quickly to the economic base in order to explain all essentially, cultural phenomena. And so a more complex hermeneutic approach like we find in Jameson would be one that seeks to do justice to cultural phenomena by reading them, carefully and considering them very carefully and in a more complex way. And yet, finally, the base is going to be seen as what is determinate of the superstructure. And if one leaves that notion behind, then one might be doing interesting cultural critical theory, but it would then thereby become a question whether or not one were still doing Marxism or Marxian theory, because Marxian theory is going to insist upon the base as what is finally determinate. Okay, so another term to be familiar with here, you see ideology. This is our imaginary relation to the real. Okay, put real in quotes there. Now, Marx in some places will call ideology a false consciousness, and it does indeed have that meaning. It was Napoleon that actually coined this term, and the thinking being sort of, you have ideology, I have truth. But it's also important to note, approaching this concept dialectically, that for Marx, that there's also a sense in which that you can't really, that there's no outside of ideology, because our relationship to the real is always mediated. And so the task then for many Marxian theorists becomes to construct a valorized concept of ideology. So we don't want to think of ideology merely as sort of a term of abuse or as a matter of false consciousness, although it can have that meaning when one says doing a critique of ideology. But it also is something that because everybody's relationship to the real, to the base, which is a there that's not there in this case, is nonetheless has to be mediated. And then I just very quickly note this, you're going to come across this quite often, this expression ISA. This is ideological state apparatus, very famous essay in Louis Althusser's book, Lenin and Philosophy. It's many, I know through the years when I've discussed the ISA essay in Althusser with students, many students really enjoy it. It's a very provocative notion. But again, I note that Althusser was a structuralist Marxist who saw himself as being, in some sense, sort of post-Hegelian, or at least very critical of the Hegelian component in Marxist thought. All right, well, let's look at Marx's critique of Hegel, which is dialectical also in the sense that he's going to affirm some aspects of it but reject others. Okay, here's Marx. He's going to say, and he's thinking, think of Hegel here in the background of what he's saying here. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of sustenance, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization, or again, mode of production. The production of ideas, of conceptions, of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, the mental intercourse of men appear at this stage as the direct efflux of their material behavior. The same applies to mental productions as expressed in the language of politics, laws, morality, religion, metaphysics of a people. Okay, note there just real quickly when he says, I put metaphysics in italics because, again, the claim that's being made here is that what he's doing is not metaphysical. Okay, so he's saying metaphysics as well as being something that is a matter of ideology. That's why philosophy is part of the superstructure for Marx, and one that so that for Marx, a philosopher like Heidegger could no more avoid his connection to the economic base or to this question of scarcity, which is finally what is determinate in Marx's thought, than could a poet or a priest. That all of them, poets, priests, philosophers, for Marx, like to think of themselves as being, independent of these base kinds of considerations. But nobody escapes this for Marx, including Heidegger, would be Marx's view. Men are the producers of their conceptions, ideas, etc., real active men as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces, by which he means, mode of production, social, which is a social form organized to address the problem of scarcity or lack, and of the intercourse corresponding to these up to its furthest forms. Okay, and here's a key quote. Now, consciousness, I think he's thinking of Hegel here, consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence. And the existence of men is their actual life process. Okay? So this is where Marx is going to develop this very famous analogy, which you'll hear all the time. But I wanted to show you an image of this because it's something most of us are not as familiar with, perhaps as what people would have been in Marx's day. This is the analogy of the camera obscura. Okay, so these, you can see there on the right, a camera obscura. These were known, long before the invention of photography. Like in the medieval period, people thought they were demonic, because you can see here, if you look at the way it functions, that the image on the left with the figure on the far left, when his image is refracted through the camera obscura, it's refracted on the wall upside down. It's a really clear image. You can see how people in the Middle Ages who had never seen, for instance, a film might have been really freaked out by it, because it looks like you're watching a movie or something, or a videotape, or just watching something on your computer. And yet the image that you see is completely inverted. It's upside down. And so this is basically what he's going to say about Hegel, is that Hegel had it right, but he had it as in a camera obscura. He had his feet up in the air and his head on the ground, whereas Marx has his feet on the ground and his head in the air. So Marx is going to, in his view, going to take Hegel and flip him on his head, put his feet firmly on the ground where they belong. Okay? All right, if in all ideology men and their circumstances appear upside down as in a camera obscura, this phenomena arises as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina from their physical life processes. In direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, and he's thinking here of the Hegelians and those people influenced by Hegel, as well as Kant, here we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real, active men on the basis of their real life process. We demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. Okay, so again, you note this repetition of this idea of we're interested in real men. Okay, I've talked about this myself when I say we think of Kant and his cosmopolitan right, which is based on the idea of that we're in an existential sense seated across from one another. We have to put our 2 feet somewhere on the ground. So we've talked about a kind of an existentialist ethics. As opposed to a kind of a Platonic ideal ethics where ethical grounds are elsewhere. Okay, so here, what Marx is very interested in something, similar. He's saying, look, we're interested, he's saying, in real people, real men, not and the real circumstances that they confront as they struggle against this problem of scarcity. But it does raise the question of, well, what does it mean to be a real man if a real man is not a matter of being a metaphysical construction? And this is the question that Derrida is going to wrestle with in Specters of Marx, where he's going to find that sometimes Marx does get out of a kind of a metaphysics of presence, or what's called ontology, of a traditional ontological way of thinking about what it means to be a real man or a real person, but other times his view is predicated upon a pretty garden variety conservative ontology, which Derrida is going to take issue with. Now I'll note this is a debate. Many this is one of the reasons why I said, I don't know, very way back in the beginning of the series, I said that he got very angry with Spivak at the conclusion of Ghostly Demarcations, precisely because she criticized his reading of Marx as being, too ensconced in a conservative metaphysical, thinking of what it means to be a real man. And other Marxist critics of Derrida responded in similar ways. This is the debate. You can read these texts and judge for yourself about whether or not Marx did indeed succeed, like Hegel, in arriving at a sort of post-metaphysical theory, which is, again, different from philosophy. Okay, the phantoms or the specters formed in the human brain. So now let's pause here again for just a minute too, because I put specters in brackets there, because Marx is going to later do a reading of these phantoms or specters. This is going to be at the heart of Derrida's critiques, but let's just note, I want to put a little asterisk by this, because what he's calling a phantom here, or what we're calling a specter, is also a trace, an empirical trace, an impression, what we discussed in the British empiricist sense, that enters your body on the lens of your eyes. Okay, so now we have this kind of a problem that we're seeing here of what is a phantom. What is a specter? We've got a real man. We've got the specter of a man, a phantom. What's going on in this language? This is going to be something that we're definitely going to return to when we read Specters of Marx. Okay, so the phantom specters formed in the human brain are also necessarily sublimates of their material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. Okay, so is the real a specter? Or is there a real? For Marx, he's underscoring here the fact that specters, in any case, are indeed material, empirically verifiable specters of men, of women, of images, of objects do enter our bodies on the lens of our eyes. Morality, religion, metaphysics, again, what we're calling the superstructure, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence from the base. Okay, so what he's saying here then is that the whether we're talking about ethics, whether we're talking about your religious orientation, or whether your metaphysical orientation, again, if you're a philosopher like Heidegger, you don't escape your independence on the economic base. It's not possible. We don't get out of that, because we're all sort of stuck in the same soup. We all have to address the issue of scarcity necessity if we are to continue to survive as a human species. Okay, Marx. Life is not determined by consciousness. This is really very, very famous quote. And when you're reading this, think of Hegel here, because this is his rebuke to Hegel. Because what he's calling consciousness here is very akin to what Hegel is talking about when he speaks of the consciousness of self that comes through entering into these situations of struggle with the other. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. In the first method of approach, the Hegelian method, the starting point is consciousness taken as the living individual. In the second, it is the real living conditions, which would be the economic ones, the individuals themselves as they are in actual life. And consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness. Okay, so there's basic difference between what drives the dialectic in the case of Hegel, the desire for recognition, or what he's calling spiritedness. In the case of Marx, it's always the economic that drives the base. Okay, now here I'm going to just bring a quick quote here from Derrida to give you a sense of how he's going to respond to Marx, and we'll develop this more later. When you read Specters of Marx, he's going to say, Marx continues to want to ground his critique or his exorcism of the spectral simulacrum in an ontology. Okay, ontology, ontos means being, logos is logi, you know that term. So ontology, it's a word that Heidegger is very critical of, but it means, sort of thinking of philosophies of being, discourses on being. It is a critical but pre-deconstructive ontology of presence as actual reality and as objectivity. Okay, but he qualifies this. He says, now pre-deconstructive here does not mean false, unnecessary, or illusory. Rather, it characterizes a relatively stabilized knowledge, but one that calls for questions more radical than the critique itself, and then the ontology that grounds the critique. Okay, so this is a really interesting quote. So he's saying, Marx, has many contributions to make, but he himself, if he had thought through what Derrida is essentially saying is if he had thought more deeply about what he's saying, particularly with regard to the question of specters and the specter or the empirical trace impressions, he would have ended up in an even more radical deconstructive position than he actually ends up in, because he's still sort of stuck in a metaphysics of presence, which is also true for Derrida of Hegel as well. Okay, that's just a quick introduction to that. We will address that more when we get to Specters of Marx. Okay, so we're getting to the conclusion here of our lecture now. So I just want to say a couple things here about, we talked in our last lecture about the question of progress and this notion of an end of history, where history is going. Kant says it's terrible, the conflicts are terrible, but they're taking us to a good place, to a place where we could experience, the end of history, or the end of these endless, conflicts that beset us. And so Fukuyama, as we're going to see, is going to make a case for the end of history. He later revises that view in light of all of the terrible historical things that have happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I don't know that he necessarily. I haven't read the more recent stuff except in reviews of it. But I'm doubtful that he ends up rejecting the kind of affirmation of this sort of liberal democratic Hegelianism that he affirms in the End of History. But in any case, the Abrahamic traditions in Derrida's Specters of Marx, he notes this. We're going to come back to this word teleology there. Telos means end, or in logi again, discourse, word. So a teleology is a discourse about the end. And all of these thinkers and these traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, have sort of thinkings about the end of the world. So for instance, in the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, all of them have a messianism within them. In Judaism, obviously, the Messiah has not come yet, but is believed to come. For instance, there's a saying very famous saying, that if everybody were to obey the Torah for just one instant, then the Messiah would come. But the Messiah is something, because is more about expectation in Judaism. This is going to be true in Derrida's thought as well. Derrida is Jewish. It's about waiting for the Messiah to come. Now, in Christianity, the Messiah, in Christianity and Islam both, because Jesus is the Messiah in both traditions, the Messiah is said to have come. But also in Christianity and Judaism, the Messiah, Jesus, is said to will come again at the end of the world. So there's also this kind of idea that the Messiah, Jesus, will return, and when he returns, he will usher in the end of history. In Kant and Hegel, we get an idea of a kind of a idea of, like basically, when every country in the world has a Republican constitution, is a liberal democracy with a Republican constitution. Because as Fukuyama is going to observe, liberal democratic states don't tend to get into wars with one another, and so he imagines himself that there might be some possible, in this Hegelian sense, way to achieve or what Kant's going to call a state of perpetual peace, which doesn't mean that there wouldn't continue to be conflicts, but they wouldn't be of the kind that are so terrible now. And we think of these cataclysmic, wars. There would be instead, prestige contests, as we're going to see, Fukuyama arguing, because the thymotic part of who we are as people runs so deeply that it's not only is it not possible to root it out, the question also needs to be asked, is it desirable to root it out? Okay, that's one view. In Marx, it's when we reach this communist mode of production, we reach an effective end of history. Jameson's going to speak of pensée sauvage, and we're going to see, I don't want to get into that today, but we will return to that, and we're going to see also that Jameson's thought is deeply driven by this sort of utopian impulse. And Jameson really is perhaps the most important contemporary thinker of utopias. This is for instance, why he has a long-standing interest in science fiction. So I don't know of any other thinker that has thought more about the concept, question, issue of utopia than Jameson. It's a word that appears nowhere in Derrida's thought. But Derrida does, speak of messianism, and we're going to also get into this contrast that he makes between messianism and messianicity, which is, messianism would be more like, in a Kantian sense, like a dogmatic, articulation of messianism, like as exists in the Abrahamic traditions. Messianicity is more like a structure of expectation, which is going to connect to what Heidegger calls the Zusage, or this idea of waiting for the truth, for the other to speak the truth to us. Also linked to what Heidegger calls, the questioning being the piety of thought, or what he's calling the piety of thought. We'll come back to that. Okay, so last image here. These are the texts that we're going to read down the road. We'll look at Fukuyama's End of History and the Last Man. We'll read Derrida's Specters of Marx. And then we'll look at some aspects of ghostly demarcations. And these are responses of Marxist critics to Derrida. So in Derrida's text, Specters of Marx, he's responding to Fukuyama. And in ghostly demarcations, these are writers who are responding to Derrida. So that's all for this lecture, and the next set of lectures that we'll have will be related directly to Heidegger. The next place that we'll go more deeply into Heidegger by reading his Introduction to Metaphysics.